agenda or that is on the consent agenda? I see no hands. Next item is approval of the agenda.
Move approval.
Second.
Madam Chair,
Mr. Smith.
I'd like to request adding one additional item under 13. You see there a closed session to discuss the Healy lawsuit. We'd like to add a second item to discuss the attorney's advice concerning a claim brought by a former employee. So that would be item 13B. And before we get to item 13, I'll also recommend a motion for the board to adopt to go into closed session for all of those.
Thank you. Anything else? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Agenda is approved. We have no information items or correspondence this evening, so we are on to the consent agenda. I would like to move the October 22nd minutes off the consent agenda, placing them at 10.2.
Second.
And otherwise,
Not until she calls for it.
that was the only item, actually. So did you have a motion? I'm sorry, Manager Miller?
Yeah, so moved.
Second.
All right. I don't know what that means exactly. There's nothing to move, actually, is there?
Well, that was the discussion.
Yeah, we didn't know for sure.
All those in favor?
I think it's just if you object,
Aye.
it comes off.
I know. I think that's our rule, too.
Yeah.
Under President's report, I have a liaison report. I need to just briefly find my page here. The Wayzata Lake Effect Steering Committee met earlier this week. The Technical Advisory Committee met the same day, and there was a community meeting, and our staff, Renee Clark, is on the TAC there. The consultants were in town to give us an overview of their design team, introduce us, some preliminary thoughts about the site and their approach to funding and the value of establishing a conservancy. They certainly mentioned water quality issues, and Ms. Clark had done a good job, I think, on the TAC earlier in the day. They not only talked about end of pipe and sheet flow and parking lot runoff, but they also talked about regional stormwater treatment, and they're well aware of the need to be working on those issues. They'll next meeting will be in December, at which time there'll be some preliminary design principles coming up. That is all I have. And Manager Olson, OPC Committee.
Okay, we have detailed minutes of the OPC committee meeting. However, in summary, we did three major discussions. One was about an AIS partnership, where in partnership with private citizens as well as the city in Victoria, we would be able to develop a test regional inspection site. We're asking our staff to look into that and see if there's an opportunity for us to put something like that together with interested citizens. We also went through a list of all the contractors that are actually the top 15 contractors, and we reviewed the roles that they play in assisting with the district. And we also went through a review of the bid process and how we go about soliciting bids for council, engineering services, as well as the administrator.
Thank you. The upcoming meeting and event schedule is published through the end of the year. We have no public hearings or permits this evening, so we'll move to item 10.1, which is the minutes from October 22nd. I have a couple of changes I'd like to have made, and legal counsel has something as well. At line 542, I would like it to read of governance issues that need to be addressed and they have yet to be presented rather than addressed. And at line 552, I'd like to put a period after issues and strike the remainder of that sentence. The next words would be upon vote. And Mr. Smith, there were changes from your end?
Yes, these are mostly corrections of typos. On page 2 at line 66, insert the word that, so the line would read, incurred as part of the project that led to an exceedance. On page 3 at line 109, change the spelling so that it's lake effect rather than affect.
Emotional lakes.
Right. on line 130, also on page 3, a report to the legislature about groundwater, surface water interactions, deleting the word "the." Then on to page 5. At line 197, there must be punctuation. I can't, let's just skip line 197. That must
All right.
Line 199 and 200 would be revised to read, managers will take comment from the public and attendees at the meeting tonight, but repetitive comments and comments that are not relevant to MCWD's authority are disfavored. Nothing on page 6. On page 7, at line 275, seeing none, she asked if the managers had any questions. At line 280, the words "that with" be deleted, so that read "and the construction of." At line 284, associated rain garden singular, deleting the S. At line 285, change "is" to "are" in the plans "are" typical details. At line 289, deleting the word "as," so that reads "and that the district staff." At line 292, delete the words "will not," so that it reads "property owners in the surrounding area." At line 293, insert the word "permit," so that read "notice of each individual home permit as it comes to MCWD." At line 296, insert the word "be," so that it reads "and will be in place at the time of development." Line 297, delete the words "that the city required." Those are just duplicative words. At line 298, add an S to the word "site," so that it read "rain garden sites." At line 300, it reads, Mr. Meehan stated that their district, change it to that the district. On to page 8. At line 328, correct the spelling of the word "passed," P-A-S-S-E-D. At line 342, delete the extra period. At line 343, add the letter S to design costs, plural. On page 9, at line 372, delete the words "if any." I apologize, I have just one more page, at page 11. At 432, delete the word "a" so that it reads "land rights for the restoration is particularly critical." Line 435, insert "the City of Victoria." Line 440, insert a comma after "PennTom." Line 445, a comma after 2016. Line 448, delete the word "the" before "staff." Line 452, delete the word "right." Line 453, insert the word "for" now for 2017. At line 460, just no changes necessary, never mind. That's it.
Thank you very much. With those
I
changes.
apologize, I have one more.
Oh.
At page 13, this is probably more substantive. At line 541, it should insert the words "amend the motion to cancel," so that it reads Manager Miller moved and Manager White seconded to amend the motion to cancel the directive. I have all these in writing also for the record.
Is there a motion to approve the minutes
Move
as
approval.
corrected? Is there a second?
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Resolution 15-093, Ms. Domjancic.
Madam President, managers, following stormwater pond sediment surveys conducted in April of this year, it was determined that the Gleason North stormwater ponds 2 and 3 required maintenance to retain their function. Bids for maintenance of these ponds was let on October 14th of this year, and a mandatory pre-bid bidding was held on October 23rd. Bids were due on October 30th, and a total of 6 bids were received by the district. Sunram Construction submitted a bid of $45,064. Excuse me. Minnesota Dirt Works submitted a bid of $49,791. Blackstone Contractors $67,729. New Look Contracting $83,792. GF Chidlicki $89,696, and Vite and Company $116,477. Sunderland Construction obviously submitted the lowest qualified bid of $45,064, and staff requests that the board forward this item to the November 19th consent agenda for final approval. I'll take any questions.
Is there a motion to get this before us?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
Motion and second. Are there any questions? Manager Blixt?
There's a big spread.
Yes, there is indeed.
What do you attribute the big spread?
The two kind of major items on the bid tab were the dewatering and the excavation, and Sunram had the lowest numbers of all contractors for those two major items. All the other contractors had significantly higher numbers for those two major items.
But
Any reasoning behind it?
Yeah.
One may be that they have a close site for depositing the sediment that was removed. They have a site in Corcoran, and that's kind of close and easy to transport the sediment to be removed. And they're familiar with these ponds. They actually dredged the North Pond in 2012 or 2011, I believe. So they have some familiarity with the site and might be able to kind of attribute lower cost to those items.
Okay. Mr. Meehan?
Manager
Thank
White,
you.
managers, Sunrise Construction also did the Long Lake ponds, and so we've seen that they've figured out the proximity component of it with the dirt moving, so their unit costs end up just being a lot lower compared to a lot of the other contractors. Like Mike didn't have a really close location, that's why their costs were essentially double what we had for them. So.
Manager Olson?
And that pond you said they did, the north one, is that the one we see in the photograph?
Correct. Yep, the one north
Outside
of
of
those
the red.
two. Correct.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay.
Manager Calkins?
I was most concerned with the temporary dewatering difference, since Sunram was the second lowest and $11,000 less than the engineer's bid. So why would that be?
It's another good question. I don't know for sure why Sunram had that lower number. Again, like Chris said, they did control the dewatering for the Long Lake Creek Restoration Project, and so maybe they have some kind of recent familiarity with dewatering a site like that with a lot of sediment.
So there wouldn't be some reason to be
Some
concerned that they'd
suspicious
run
of?
into trouble on that?
No, and it is a lump sum cost, and so we're not concerned that that will be an overrun, but they have a specific cost assigned to that item, so have set their price.
Thank you. Mr. Meehan?
Manager White, Manager Hawkins, usually we see with Sunram is they'll use their pumps, so they'll run them out for a long piece of time. Usually the dewatering is all tied into their pump costs that come along with that. So where they have a good price on pumping, that just ends up being reflected in the dewatering. Some of them also hedge on having a dry fall, and so by having a drier fall that we've had, they're assuming that.
Until
Well,
yesterday.
They're assuming that they don't have big, plump, full ponds that they have to dewater. And so that's where it's been nice that they have to do a mandatory walkthrough to just gauge how high the ponds are and how much they have to dewater. And the fact that they had to go out there, they've done work out here before, they kind of have a feeling for how much dewatering that they think they're going to need. So.
Considering that the water in my yard is the highest it's been all summer right now, I don't know that that's a good idea if they did that. But
Yeah, that's why it's a lump sum cost that's where they're
But the staff recommendation is that this is a responsible bidder. Yeah.
Yeah,
Overall.
I can't recall the number, but Sunram did Long Lake Ponds, and I believe they came in 10 to 15% below their estimate as well. So it's a contractor we've worked with in the past and have had a good relationship.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All those, Manager Miller?
Several years ago, we decided to have a comprehensive plan on pond maintenance because we had agreements with local units of government that weren't being honored. They were pretty much abandoning their responsibility. Do we have such agreement with Plymouth on this?
We do, yes, we're the entity.
Are they going to share any costs with us?
Not a sharing cost, no, Manager Miller. They are providing some assistance with access easements and the permitting of the work, but in terms of cost, no, the district is.
But we had an agreement with them that they were going to maintain the ponds when we built them?
I don't know that for certain.
I don't believe that was the case for these ponds.
These are, my recollection is these specific ponds, the district contracted for the maintenance for these when it
Okay.
originally constructed them. It wasn't something that the city was delinquent on, and the cities, and then the watershed districts assumed control over.
Okay, thank you.
Are we ready to vote? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you very much, Mr. Neal and Mr. Neal. Item 10.3, Mr. Smith, the board adoption of findings of fact and conclusions for permit 15-445, Mooney Lake Preserve.
Madam Chair and managers, you'll recall at your last meeting, you held a hearing and considered the permit application 15445 for Mooney Lake Preserve. At your October 22nd meeting, you took action on the permit, but you also directed that findings and conclusions be prepared for your consideration at this meeting. So this matter that's before you is not the decision on the permit, but it's the documentation of that decision. So the draft of the resolution was distributed. It basically recites the background, the nature of the permit application, the issues that were reviewed by staff, the presentations that were made during the public hearing, the issues considered by the board, and the board's reasoning to its outcome, and it affirms the legal authority for the decision that you made. There are a few corrections or changes we'd like to recommend to the draft that was distributed to you. One is similar to a change that Manager Calkins caught in the minutes on page 6, paragraph 50. It should read, Mr. Meehan stated that the district, not that their district. So that should be corrected. We'd also like to recommend at line, paragraph, just after paragraph 60, a new paragraph be inserted that would read as follows. All of the technical materials submitted by the applicant and analyzed by the district staff and engineer for purposes of rendering findings and providing recommendations to the Board of Managers were provided to plaintiff's experts more than 1 week prior to the October 22nd, 2015 meeting, at which the Board of Managers rendered a decision on application 15-445. I do want to point out that I think there was some discussion of this at the meeting on October 22nd, and some misunderstanding about the placement of documents in the file as made available to Mr. Olivier. What we have confirmed is that he did his initial review based on some of the documents. A few other documents were added after that. He was later made aware of that for a week before the hearing, and so that's what this paragraph is inserted to correct. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
I would draw your attention to paragraph 21. It says that the information was emailed to the board and then uploaded, and I wonder if that couldn't be expanded to make clear who was receiving that information when it was uploaded. That would be the board and the public, I think. Uploaded to our website.
To the public website.
And that wouldn't
If
hurt
that's
to
correct.
add that information.
Can you just repeat the paragraph?
Paragraph 21.
I'll just look to the staff to confirm that that in fact is the case.
That's what we're talking about. Is it all over to the public website or is it
The Dropbox.
consultants to review the Dropbox? It was all uploaded to the Dropbox for the consultants to review.
Okay, thank you.
So then we won't make the change
No,
to paragraph 21, okay?
thank you. Any other questions? Is there a motion to adopt the findings?
So moved.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
And thanks to Mr. Welch and Mr. Baker, of course, too. Next item is the E-grade program update. Ms. Christensen and Dooley, and Mr. Bischoff and Ms. Spector. I got it. I was recognizing Ms. Christensen in absentia, apparently.
She was here.
President White, board and managers. Every spring, I receive phone calls from realtors requesting the recent lake grades, usually around Lake Minnetonka. I never receive phone calls from realtors along Minnehaha Creek. Our current assessment system is only focused on lakes, and only lakes. The E-grade program will change that. Got to turn this on, that might help. So we're here tonight to inform you about the great progress we've been making on the Ecosystem Evaluation Program, or the E-grade program. And we've had a new administrator and a new board member join us since the beginning of this program. We want to reaffirm how important this program is to the district. We're going to be reviewing tonight where we are with the program, the relationship to the watershed planning, scaling from features to sub-watershed, and then the next steps. So before we really get into it, we want to thank our technical partners. We couldn't do this without them. We have a wide array of technical expertise to help us build and develop this scientific tool. So the mission of the program is to build a scientifically defensible watershed-wide ecosystem evaluation tool. That's a mouthful. Essentially, we were developing an ecosystem evaluation tool. And with that tool, we'll assess the watershed condition, the health and its function on a graded scale, and we'll identify issues and potential stressors in targeted areas, and then those results will be used to drive management activities. So our current system is pretty much focused on phosphorus and mostly monitored in deep lakes. Now, let me describe this picture before you. The top step one is ecosystem services. And what are ecosystem services? They're what nature provides for free. Nature provides nutrient cycling in our systems for free. And we're monitoring that in deep lakes. But the ecosystem evaluation tool that we're building currently, that we're building now, is going to be looking at ecosystem services such as biodiversity, habitat diversity, nutrient cycling, flood control, recreation, and drinking water supply. And we're not only going to be monitoring them in deep lakes, but in the shallow lakes, wetlands, streams, groundwater, and uplands. So it's a huge improvement from the current system. So how are we going to implement the new system? So we have our ecosystem services, what nature provides for free. We're going to monitor these major systems, and then we're going to evaluate and grade them in individual water bodies, and then in the sub-watersheds. We're going to identify potential issues and stressors, and then those results will go into developing and implementing policies and actions. And we'll communicate the results using the expertise of our communications program, through E-grade reports, and then through the watershed management plan. Now in the watershed management plan that's being currently developed for 2017, the E-grade program will be outlined, it'll be defined, the purpose will be stated, and then how it's going to be implemented will be stated as well. We'll also include the completed sub-watershed assessments and Any issues and stressors will be identified in the comprehensive plan as well. So you may have seen this before in some other informational updates we have provided, but the list here is, okay, I can't use a pointer, but we have the biodiversity, habitat diversity, nutrient cycling, flood control, recreation, and drinking water supply. Those are our ecosystem services, and this is our example for deep and shallow lakes. This is what the consultant and the staff have been focusing on, the deep and shallow lakes. And the green boxes are what we're actually going to be monitoring, or the indicators we're going to be monitoring in each of these ecosystem services. Oh, let me backtrack. So the fish community and vegetation community under biodiversity, habitat diversity, and as well as shoreline health, our partners have provided a wide array of knowledge and data to help us build these and monitor these. So we are monitoring, we're building this ecosystem evaluation tool based on data collected in 6 Mile Marsh, Shuts Lake, and the Minnehaha Creek subwatershed. Now with the latest budget constraints, that schedule hasn't changed. We're still going to still complete the evaluation tool development by 2017. And they'll begin to monitor the next group of subwatersheds in 2018. And then the last group will be started in 2021. So what did we do this summer? We monitored lakes. We did vegetation surveys. We did fish community surveys by doing nearshore steining, electric fishing, and trap net and gill netting. We did this only, so the fish surveys were done on deep lakes only, while the vegetation surveys were done on both deep and shallow. And we couldn't have done the fish survey without the helps of WENC and as well as the DNR. Wetlands, we monitored over 50 wetlands in the 3 subwatersheds. WENC did it all. I'm not even going to take credit for it. WENC did all the work. They did vegetation surveys as well as sediment core surveys. And then district staff did macroinvertebrate surveys as well as habitat stream assessment surveys based on the MPCA protocol, which is the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's protocol, in our 3 major creeks, 6 Mile, Minnehaha Creek, and then Shuts Lake Creek. And then I'll let Joe take over.
Great. Madam Chair, managers, I just want to start off by saying thank you for the opportunity to work on this project. I mean, these are kind of the projects that get an ecologist out of bed in the morning and excited to do what he does, right? I mean, this is fascinating stuff, and it's interesting to be able to take a watershed and dissect it into all its pieces and services and then try to put it all together into something that helps you make better management decisions. And that's ultimately what we're trying to do. So what I'd like to do is walk you through what we're doing for 6 Mile Marsh right now, kind of show you how we're pulling that apart, we're shuffling the deck of all these services, and how it's going to fit into the planning process to help you make better decisions, to help spur policy discussions, and help that whole process through. Okay? So if we start with 6 Mile Marsh here, there was a diagnostic study that was done in the past. I did that study, and it really focuses on a number of management areas, and we focus on hydrology and nutrients, right? That's the traditional paradigm. We study nutrients, we figure out where the phosphorus load's coming from, we identify projects to reduce that. Well, what we're saying now is the picture's bigger than that in terms of ecosystem services. There's a lot more things that watershed's providing. How do we start to look at that and shift from the nutrient paradigm to now an ecosystem service paradigm? Okay? So this is our traditional paradigm. We come up with a subwatershed map that looks like this. We say, oh, there's all these subwatersheds, they're high phosphorus loads. We better go out and put a pond out there, do an iron enhanced sand filter, whatever we do. But I think it's a bigger picture than that, and we can start to look at other stressors that come into there. How does hydrology change affect some of these other communities that go in there? So if we start to look at how our system is set up, we have the 6 Mile Creek watershed. And then we can start thinking about ecosystem services. So what we want to do is try to understand how each of these services layer into how that watershed is functioning. So how does it provide biodiversity? Are all our systems that are in there, are they biodiverse? Are they providing stable systems? Those types of things. And habitat diversity. Are they providing habitat not only for the organisms that live there all around, the fish, those other things, but those transitory organisms too, like waterfowl and those other things. Is it processing nutrients at an appropriate scale? Right? Is it handling phosphorus at an appropriate way? Or is it exporting phosphorus? Nitrogen's another one we can think about. Is it handling nitrogen in a proper way, or is it exporting it down to the Gulf hypoxia issue? Right? We can ask those types of questions. Flood control. Is it providing flood control? This is why watershed districts were originally started, right? It was to handle flooding issues, drainage issues, and a lot of those things. But is the watershed processing it, and what components of the watershed are handling that? And recreation. Is it providing the recreational benefits that we want for the environment that we have in the watershed? So those are the ecosystem services that we've really focused on. One more, drinking water supply, right? I know this is big in the metro area, so we thought, how does it connect into the drinking water supply, the metro-wide groundwater model, and these depressions? We wanted to link that use to how you manage your water resources, because groundwater is a big issue. So we've got 6 ecosystem services, and we've got to layer all those into the watershed and ask the question, how well is this watershed providing those services? Okay? So that brings us back to the watershed. Now we've got to dissect that watershed into its components. What are the major components that would provide those? Lakes. Lakes provide biodiversity, certain types of habitat, provide flood control. Streams, that's your stormwater conveyance systems, as well as habitat for fish, connectivity, macroinvertebrates, some of those other pieces. Wetlands provide a multitude of services, whether they're habitat for different waterfowl, whether it's flood control is a big one, diversity in the plant community. Uplands, these are also an important linkage to the water system that goes in there and those issues. And then groundwater, how does it all link to the groundwater, and how does the health of the two systems interact and control those? So it's complex, right? We have the components of the watershed, and we have the ecosystem services. So what we need to do is to break apart each one of these into our systems where we have lakes, and then we understand how in lakes it handles all these ecosystem services. How do wetlands handle all of these ecosystem services, and down the line to the components. And so you come up with all these stacks, and you basically shuffle all those cards, right? So we're going to slide all those cards together to evaluate how that system goes. And what you come out with is a mishmash map that looks something like this. This isn't even everything. And so you look at this and you go, geez, how do we start to make sense of this, right? I mean, this is kind of a grade of how well lakes and different wetlands are providing ecosystem services. And that's going to be layered on top of each other. So what we're doing is we're developing this into a grading system where you would look at each ecosystem service independently. Okay? So you would start with, say, biodiversity here, and you could say, okay, in this subwatershed, and this is the kind of report card that would come out for each subwatershed, how well is it supporting biodiversity? Well, here you could say, well, for lakes, wetlands, and streams, they're impaired. They're not providing it very well. And I can talk a little bit about how we come up with those scoring systems, but I don't want to go too far into that. But uplands are supporting based on our grading scale. We haven't gotten uplands yet, so this is all made up data, right, to just kind of show you how it works through. And then the question is for biodiversity, can you come out with an overall watershed grade? Do we want to take the step from biodiversity in each one of these features into, well, it's supporting biodiversity on a supporting level or an impaired level? And I'm going to define those for you in a minute. Okay? Well, then you can turn it around, right? There's another way to look at this. You can say, okay, how are lakes doing in the watershed? Well, we can say each one of these ecosystem services, how are lakes as a group providing this ecosystem service? So biodiversity, maybe they're impaired because there's not enough biodiversity across our fish and plant communities and lakes. And we want to develop programs and activities to start to increase biodiversity in those two communities. Habitat diversity. So it allows you to develop these kind of planning strategies that go in there. So right now, this is where we're at. We're using a number of different tools that have been developed by the state. Most of them are indices of biotic integrity, which allows you to develop a scoring system along what we call the biological condition gradient. And all that says is that there's a very healthy biological condition and a very unhealthy, and that changes with stress. So as you increase stress, the biological community begins to degrade. Okay? And so we started with the state evaluation, and we said, okay, they're using basically impaired and unimpaired. They've developed breakpoints along that biological condition gradient to define those two. We said we want to be consistent with that, right? There's a lot of work and thought put into those breakpoints. And then a lot of the programs are also developing what they consider exceptional waters. So those are those waters or conditions in the biological condition gradient that will be very high quality, lots of species richness, whatever metric that you're trying to measure. But then the unimpaired waters, we wanted to break those out into other categories. So that's what we've been working on too, is developing this impaired and degraded. And so impaired would mean that, you know, it's restorable, you could probably get that ecosystem service back, but it's going to take some effort and thought how to do that. Degraded means it's totally gone. It's not providing that service at all. We've lost all those kinds of conditions that go in there. And so with each one of these, we can have the grading system and then the narrative description along that biological condition gradient. So we can use all those metrics and all that work that goes into it to really define to a very specific level, it's lacking in tolerant species, right? We can get down to that level. So from a management standpoint, we can really dive into what's driving those factors. And those are all kind of changed with the stress gradient. That's how the models were developed. So we can link the stress to the change in the community, manage that stress, and lead into that policy. Okay, so this is how our system, we really are seeing it break out as into these 4 categories: exceptional, supporting, impaired, and degraded. We had a technical advisory committee meeting this morning. There was some talk about, are these the right terms? How do we roll this out? This is my scientific term, right? I'm not necessarily saying this is what your outreach group would say. Yes?
Can we ask questions?
Sure. Oh.
Go ahead, Mr. Miller.
These classifications, it's pretty clear, you know, what they represent. Is this going to turn into a political mess later on when people are trying to develop property and we got degraded for the lake, and somebody's pressure to change those designations so they're not so alarming. From experience, I chaired the 20-year revitalization planning committee for the city of Minneapolis, and we had the neighborhoods created. The city council went crazy because some of the wards were labeled, you know, in effect degraded, and we had to come up with all kinds of meaningless terms that just lost its whole interpretation, and it lost political support from the community because they thought it was turning into a political deal. I'm wondering, are we going to run into the same kind of thing here?
Let's see what the engineers say, and we can bring that back for more discussion if we
Yeah, but
want to.
before we go too far with these classifications.
Manager Miller, I'm a scientist. I'm just a humble scientist is how I would say that. And so I think the terminology is really critical.
That won't keep you out of from getting steaked and fried.
So I would say, yeah, I mean, you know, from the political side, I think these are things, the terminology that we use would be critical, and we really should think hard about that. The terminology that we've chosen here is what's used for impairment analysis done by the state. So when they go through a 303D listing to determine whether a water is impaired or degraded, these are the terminology that they use. So this is kind of that water assessment vernacular that would come out there. But I think when you talk about outreach, I think it is important to think about what your terminology would mean and what that piece is. And I would hand that over to your public outreach people.
Exactly. Manager Miller will be working with the communications department to really make sure we're not going to the public won't be up in arms about our
I don't have any problem with it, you know.
Yeah.
I live on a degraded wetland, but
I live on a degraded bay. I think one of the things to remember is that we already have some of those exact same issues with the lake grades as they are today, in terms of who gets the A, B, C, D, E, F, D plus or D minus or whatever. So I think we already have some of that issue, so we're not adding to that issue. I think what we're doing is we're adding some clarity, some focus, and also some more robust and comprehensive assessment of the water quality from a much broader perspective. So I think that hopefully, and a lot of that is how we unroll this in terms of communication planning, but I think that it's not going to add, we already have some of that today, but this is going to kind of clarify some of those things.
Mm-hmm. It might be extremely helpful.
Yeah.
And there's reference to education and communications in your report, as I recall. Yes, that's right. Go on, Mr. Bishop.
Okay, thank you. So then what we can do is we can start to roll this into planning. So we say, okay, what we're doing is we're creating this scientific framework or scientific basis to make decisions about how we manage the watershed. And we're doing it on the ecosystem framework. So that becomes the base at which you can make planning decisions or frame your planning and what you're going to do that goes in there. And then you can look at the different stressors and how they relate. So now you're trying to change the grade, change the condition of the watershed by managing the stressors, whether that's something you know a lot about, excess nutrients, we know about that, whether it's land use change and how that changes the hydrology, we can ask the question, how does that change the ability of the watershed to deliver ecosystem services? Things like carp infestation, we can figure out how that is a stressor. How changing carp what the resultant change in ecosystem service would be. And then you can layer on opportunities. As you begin to look at the watershed, things are always changing. A development's coming in here, a road's going to go in there. Can we be nimble and use that information with the ecosystem service to make good decisions about how to move forward in improving ecosystem services? So what you end up with is a model that basically has two frames. One is your scientific basis for how you make those decisions, and the other one is the opportunities and projects and things that come out of that. Those two frames can constantly change. As we understand better science and how ecosystem services are, we can adapt our system to regrade and rework through that, and you can constantly maneuver as opportunities and stuff change. So by creating those frames that interact allows us to make good decisions about how to move forward in terms of planning. Okay? And it also helps you with things like cost share, permitting, and some of those other factors that are in there. So then what you can do is you can start to develop tables like this, and again, we're just kind of showing you examples of what it could look like, where we say, okay, what are we going to do to protect ecosystem biodiversity, ecosystem service biodiversity in lakes? We know it's impaired. We use our metrics to determine it's impaired because it has lack of habitat to support the fish community. That's one of our major driving factors. And frequent algal blooms from high phosphorus. So we can develop management actions, increase shoreline complexity by 30%. Again, we have metrics to say exactly what to do there, and you can use that to drive things like shoreline ordinances. This is if you have developed on a shoreline, this would be the expected ordinance that would protect this ecosystem service. You can develop projects out of it, and those things can adjust over time. So you develop tables like this that can begin to link to those individual ecosystem services and develop those management activities without going into each one of those. But you can do it for wetlands and uplands and streams. So that was really just an overview of how we see the system coming together, the scoring system as it's kind of working, our terminology and the categories, and how we're starting to feed it in. Right now we're working on lakes, and then next year streams and wetlands. And as they start to fit together, then we'll start to be able to roll up into those big watershed conditions and start looking at those interactions. One of the interesting discussions that will come out of this, that came out of the TAC today, is there's going to be competing interest in some of these, right? Maybe this wetland's good for flood control, but that limits its ability to provide biodiversity and habitat. And so then we got to start looking at it on a watershed basis to say, okay, maybe these 10 wetlands are okay to have no diversity because they're the flood control wetlands, and the rest of these can pick up the biodiversity ecosystem service. So as we continue to develop the components, we'll roll those together into a scoring system.
Thank you. Thank you for everyone.
And there's a few, so I think Kelly has a couple more things.
Yeah, just a couple. So I mean, Joe pretty much has said a little bit of it, but next year we'll be finishing up the lakes feature, then also streams and wetlands, and we'll be starting the work on groundwater in the uplands and tying it all together with hydrology. We're also going to be working on beginning to host the community outreach meetings, as well as putting together a city TAC group, a city stakeholder group. So we get the cities involved in this process as well. And then in 2017, we'll finish
Is this, how is this outreach going to be coordinated with the planning effort outreach?
It already has been coordinated with management. It already has been. We've been providing documentation for the comp plan outreach, and so we'll be continuing to
So I
work
mean,
with-
you're not going to do separate outreach activities? Okay. Terrific, thanks.
And then so in 2017, we'll be finishing the groundwater and uplands features, and then concluding with the watershed-wide assessment, and then continuing with outreach in the communities. And then by 2018, we'll be releasing our first set of E-grades of watershed reports. Now, even though the reports are going to be released in 2018, the data that we've been collecting since 2014 is being incorporated into management activities and design faster than it ever has been before. The coordination between planning and water quality has been great, to say the least. So the identified issues and stressors through the E-grade assessment will allow the district to be more responsive and more focused throughout the watershed. And I do expect that one day I will receive a call from a realtor requesting an E-grade along Minnehaha Creek. Thank you.
Thank you. Do others have questions?
Well, that's because they expected to come over the internet.
They won't phone, I'm sorry, I missed the.
It'd be an E-grade because they expect to get
Ah, I see.
over the internet.
I was
Email.
slow, thank you, Manager Olson. Manager Calkins.
A couple of comments and questions. Understanding that even though it's been going on for a while, the process is nowhere near being complete. I'm a little bit concerned, and to be honest, I always have been concerned about when people are talking about diversity. And I think it needs to be clear, diversity is always portrayed as a good thing. And it's not. Especially when you're talking about invasive species. Certainly we've added diversity in some cases, but it hasn't been a good thing. So I think it's important that that in some fashion is addressed, and that diversity isn't just out there as this wonderful thing. So I think that in the wording that's used and in the way that diversity is assessed, I think it's important that be there. So I guess the question there would be is, how are invasive species, which are increased diversity, ultimately they may decrease diversity of native species, but how is that intended to be included in the grading?
Manager Calkins, it's a good question. So there's a lot of discussion even within the DNR about where invasive species fit, especially in terms of diversity, habitat, and some of those pieces right there. As we view it, we've had a lot of discussions internally about what's a stressor, what's a measure of health. And so we viewed, to date, we've really viewed invasive species as a stressor. When you get an establishment of invasive species, right, and they can be there and not be a stressor, not take over the plant community, and we can still offer the diversity or the habitat that we need. If they begin to take over, that's a stressor that goes in there. So to us, the invasive species management comes under that stressor side and how that affects the system's ability to provide that ecosystem service. And so we're using a tool that's been, like for aquatic vegetation, we're using a tool that was developed by the Minnesota DNR, and really it's just species richness and floristic quality, which measures that. But then we can start to look at, okay, if species richness goes down because of the invasive species taking over, then that becomes a stressor, and that changes your management to say, okay, we need to manage invasive species to this level. So that's how we viewed it to date.
Okay, just my definition of invasive means that it is being harmful. And I think that's the typical definition.
Okay.
So if it's to be defined as being invasive, it has to be harmful.
Okay.
Whether it's aquatic or terrestrial. So
Sure.
I just want to make sure that we paint the diversity picture properly in context. The other question I had relates to historical information, and so historically, what was the status of the different water bodies? And I know in a lot of cases we don't know that for some of the factors that are being followed. We did do some work with looking at phosphorus levels based on diatoms historically. So will that information be incorporated into the grades?
Manager Calkins, I think whenever you embark upon this kind of grading system, you've got to always ask the question of what's the attainable condition versus what's the reference condition, right? And so much of what we're developing here does deal with a lot of reference conditions, because to know what our expected condition would be, we need to see some other systems that are providing that same level of service. And so we do use the reference condition. I do think the biological condition gradient helps that a little bit because it defines a disturbed and undisturbed. And it may be you get to a point that these systems, for whatever reasons, are constrained to only ever reach a supporting service or not supporting service. I think this allows the context to have that discussion because you're really dividing apart what the ecosystem services are and talking about each one of those, right? So again, if we have flood control here, it's providing that service, it may never be able to attain these other systems, so that attainment becomes part of that discussion. So right now, we're using the tools that have been developed. They've been developed with the biological condition gradient, and we haven't specifically asked what's the attainability of these water bodies, because that's a whole nother research project. And we've used the reference conditions to define those. But I think as you move through management and using this, you'll begin to define that pretty clearly, and it'll help frame kind of some of your discussions.
Okay. And again, as I say, there are some of these things that there may not be information on. I think I mentioned before that the wetland that I'm on used to have yellow-headed blackbirds, but they've disappeared since I've been there. So something has happened that has degraded that wetland more. But I'm assuming that that information would not be captured.
So the way that we would look at that is we've chosen to kind of work under the paradigm that if you have good vegetation diversity, that provides the best habitat diversity, which would be the best expected condition for wildlife diversity, right? We haven't developed a system that goes into identifying key species that would provide the habitat that would bring those birds back to develop that. It's really complex to try to do that and put those pieces together. So we've had to make some assumptions or some paradigms that we're operating under. One is if we improve the plant diversity in a wetland, right by removing that stressor, that would provide better chance for habitat for the different varied species that go in there, and you'd expect to see more diverse wildlife to go there. So when we look at shallow lakes, we are looking at how well the plant community provides fish habitat, because that's very different from a diversity standpoint from what we hear from the fish biologists, as compared to waterfowl habitat, which might be more reliant on key species like wild celery, some other species you might expect to be there. The first equality index allows us to play with that a little bit in terms of the metrics we use.
The district has a lot of data that's been based on phosphorus and chlorophyll and Secchi disc, those kinds of things. Where do they fall in these new categories?
So right now we're using chlorophyll and total phosphorus as a metric to understand nutrient cycling in the lakes. Okay, so that's the primary look at that as those two responses, is how well, the lakes are an indicator of how well the watershed is processing phosphorus. So if the lakes have too much phosphorus, that's an indicator there's too much phosphorus coming into them and they're not metabolically able to process that phosphorus, right? So we're using that as an indicator, but we also realize that it's just one measure, right? So we are using chlorophyll as another measure to look at that chlorophyll and total phosphorus response. Nitrogen's one where we have less information on how well a watershed processes it. But there was a presentation at the Water Resources Conference on looking at watershed level. The amount of wetlands and lakes you have changes how much denitrification, so the more you have of those, the better it processes nitrogen. So we've been talking to the researcher at Saffold and maybe use some of her work to see if we can start to look at that spatial distribution and do some grading. How well is your watershed processing nitrogen based on how many wetlands you have and some residence time issues in some of the work that she's done.
And Secchi disc, water clarity or Secchi disc is going to be used in the recreation services.
Okay, that would have been my guess, but I didn't see it in there, so because that's where I would put it. And your response leads to the other two questions I had. One is when you're talking about nutrient cycling, you're talking about a much broader spectrum of nutrients. Is that correct? I'm assuming that chloride would end up there as well.
And chloride is not actually a nutrient, right? So it's a pollutant. And again, this is dividing what's a stressor versus what's a measure of health. So when we look at a biological condition in a stream and we see that the community structure is poor, say we've characterized it poor, we can go look at what those stressors are. Chloride would be one. If we have high chloride, that might be one of the factors driving that community change. And so we would look at that as a stressor. So it's been a real process for us to kind of go through this. What's a measure of health versus what's an actual stressor that's driving that, and to try to categorize those so that we understand how we're really going about measuring health in the watershed. So when we say nutrients, we are really looking at phosphorus and nitrogen, those two important ones. When we look at other pollutants and streams and things like that, that might affect, we're dividing those into what's a stressor versus what's a measure of health.
Okay. And then has there been any discussion yet about how the different factors would be weighted in coming up with an ultimate grade?
We'd love some input on that. What I showed you, if I can show you the slide.
Talked a little bit about that today, not the weighting, but about making one grade or leaving the individual services graded. So we're still discussing that. But we had some input by the TAC today.
Right. So where we're at right now is we pulled the watershed into its components and into its ecosystem services, and we can grade each one of those. So we know for lakes we can grade biodiversity and these other ones. We have the metrics to do that. The question is we have this overall condition in review. So can we say for overall, with all those together, can we give it a grade for how well they're in concert providing the ecosystem service, all these components? I think we can go there, but we haven't gotten to the point because we don't have all the grading systems in place for all those components. So that's coming down the road. Whether you want to combine all those into one grade for a subwatershed, I don't think you want to go there. That's just where I'm at right now, and I think our thinking is evolving on that. Because once you mush it into one number, we're not sure what that means anymore. And so right now, we feel like the discussion about each individual ecosystem service, what that means to you as a resident of that watershed or a manager of that watershed, and how that gets managed or how that gets graded is the discussion we are kind of pushing for right now.
And so far, you've been kind of leaning more towards, instead of a single letter grade or number grade, to look at more of a portfolio grade.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a broader spectrum to describe the whole situation rather than a single number or letter.
All right, and the technical advisory committee sort of was leaning that way as well, more of a portfolio.
So I think this is part of the evolution. I think that's a great way of describing it, as a portfolio grade, not necessarily having one number that represents everything, because then you don't really know what that means. But I think we're evolving in that kind of process. I think when we get out to the community, how well that gets received or wants to be explained, I think that'll help drive some of those things too, and how we do that.
I think that's the biggest drawback, is that the public relates to a grade for a lake or for a
Sure.
wetland. And I wouldn't want the communication to get lost in a bunch of different things that people can't relate to.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a fair comment. I think that's something we really would want to discuss with Telly and her group to make sure that we're kind of putting that together. And I think we wanted to get to this point first, so we had something that really showed the structure for it, so we could begin those discussions now.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Manager Blixt.
How do we take into account things that we want to protect and preserve in all of this? Because, you know, it sometimes is cheaper for us to just try and protect something from further damage than let it degrade to the point that we have to spend a ton of money to fix it later on. And so where does that factor come in? Because I know in our previous wetland grades, you know, they were protect, preserve, whatever. So are we going to take that into account in this?
I'm gonna, sorry. Manager Blix, Manager White, Manager Blix. The terminology here, where you see supporting, that's, well, we had exceptional, supporting, impaired, and degraded. And supporting is the condition where we would feel like that you want to protect that. Supporting and exceptional are the protection water bodies or the watershed features. So that's where that's where that would come in, I believe.
So when those get further defined, that will become more clear?
And we're not going to just, the conditions are not going to just be, you'll have the condition, there'll be some narrative to go along with it.
And Madam Chair, Manager Blix, I also think that when you look at this frame that's driving the information to make decisions, a lot of those things are going to be protection types of activities. To say this is where these are the resources in your subwatershed that are providing, supporting an exceptional ecosystem services, we need to have protection around those kinds of pieces. So I think that's another just kind of good part of this system, is it allows you to really look at those and define those with some metrics and science behind why you're doing that.
It's not all focused on degraded and impaired, it's on both sides.
Manager Olson.
One of the things they discussed at the last Metro Mod meeting was the DNR had their representative there who was putting together a report. And as I saw on your slides here, you showed that after you do all your grading and judging, that you can come up with the determination of what projects would have the most effect, which is great. I like this because it is a more large, big picture approach to how we handle things. But there's a report that's coming out on the 15th of December called the Negative Impacts to Surface Waters Projects. And it was required by the required of the DNR by the state legislature to be done by then. And they've been working with a cast of thousands trying to put this together for the whole state profile. And I would hope that we would take that report and incorporate it into how we make our decisions too.
Yeah, Manager, I think that's great advice, so we'll definitely look at that.
And Manager Olson, wasn't that referring specifically to the negative effects of surface water on groundwater sources?
Yep.
So that was kind of that link, and it was really, I think, initiated by the situation in Cold Springs, and the development of the brewery there that has some big needs for groundwater use. But then it's kind of getting a little bit of a broader impact. And we have had staff participating. I've been at those meetings, and so has some of our planning staff. So we've been participating in that process too.
Great. And we are going to look at groundwater as one of our components. We do recognize the importance of groundwater surface water interactions, so it'll certainly help feed into that piece.
Okay. Thank you.
Other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Administrator's report, Mr. Erdahl.
Thank you, President White and managers. A few updates on a few different things. One, earlier this week on Tuesday, we had a prescribed burn at the 6 Mile Marsh Prairie Restoration Project out in Minnetrista. That was, we had actually tried to have the burn the week prior, but the humidity was too high, so it didn't work. We couldn't get things going, but it did work on Tuesday, and we had some images and some video of that taken too, so you'll probably see some of those in some upcoming media things, and it's already been on our Facebook page and some of those types of things. We also had a meeting earlier this week, speaking at Minnetrista, with the Minnetrista mayor and some of the staff there to talk about kind of our current collaboration projects and some future potential partnership and relationship issues. So thank you for President White for attending that meeting as well, but we're looking forward to kind of looking at how that partnership and collaboration will evolve. Just an update and reminder that if people are interested in serving on the Citizens Advisory Committee, applications are being accepted through the 2nd of December. We did mention that at the last couple meetings also, but I want to keep that on everyone's radar. Our communications and education staff are at Eisenhower Community Center in Hopkins this evening for the West Metro Climate Convening. It's kind of a part of a statewide series of convenings that's presented by Climate Generation, which was formerly known as the Will Steger Foundation. So our staff is there presenting a workshop with several other community organizations this evening, and the program features meteorologist Paul Douglas and Minnesota Commerce Commissioner Mike Rothman, who are also featured speakers there. The city of Minnetonka has approached the district regarding kind of the easement and some land rights next to the Grays Bay Dam area. That has kind of a little bit of a long history going back to, I think, 79 or before. There's some things that will be coming before the board probably at the next meeting about conveying and swapping some easement and lands with a private property owner that the city of Minnetonka is doing, and so we're working with them on that project, and our planning staff will have more information that will come before the PPC next week and then eventually to the board, and it could be kind of a short timeline for that project, so I just wanted to give everyone kind of a little bit of a heads up that that's coming. And then I also actually Manager Blixt invited me and to participate in Tuesday, December 1st with various departments of the city of Minneapolis. They have monthly meetings, and they're focused on disaster and emergency preparedness, and she invited some watershed management organizations in the district to participate and talk about some of the preparations and plannings related to the flooding from last year and mitigation and responses to flooding, spills, and damage reduction. So I look forward to that in a few weeks.
Thank you. Any questions? Mr. Smith, I think you have a motion
Yes.
for us.
Madam Chair, we'd request that you adopt a motion to authorize a closed session, first to receive confidential legal advice concerning the Healy litigation, regarding the Mooney Lake Preserve project, the lawsuit, and secondly, regarding a claim brought by a former employee. In addition, you have a separate closed session for the performance evaluation of the administrator.
Is there a motion to go into closed session for those purposes?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very well. Question of process, Mr. Smith. Do we need to have the first session, close it, and then open another closed session? Are this considered two closed sessions?
I think by this motion, you can have all of them together, but the attendance will vary.
Okay. Thank you.